Hello, everybody. Okay, so you all know the story of John Wayne Gacy, right? Well, I just watched this show. It happened here in Houston, Texas in 1970 to 1973. I don't know, excuse me, how many people actually know this story, though. Back in 1973 and 1970, there was an obscene amount of boys and young men that went missing. And the police at first thought, oh, well, they're all just runaways. Now, give or take, some of the families got I guess you would say runaway letters or, whatever in the coming days of their kids going missing. But, of course, back then, too, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have cell service. They didn't have all of this stuff that we have nowadays to connect the missing dots or the missing pieces. Now, when all these kids started going missing, they were all young, like I said, young boys or young men. Some parents would receive, like I said, notes or letters in the mail or whatever, and that was actually sooner or later they would determine that those letters were forced to be written. Now, the reality was that they were not just runaways. They were actually taken, and we're going to get into this story. Okay, so there's this guy who was in his late 30s, early 40s, and he met up with these two younger men. Now, at first, when things started, he was kind of grooming them to do the things that he wanted them to do for him. And they went along with it because they were young and they also wanted money. Now, it would start off, I guess, not so innocent, but innocent enough to be just about robberies and quick ways to get money. Now, that's not how it stayed. He eventually moved on to having them invite these boys as friends or kids that had went to troubled homes or their parents were separated or whatever be the case. And he would have them bring these young men to his house and pay them $200 for each young boy or young man that they had brought to his house. Now, he had them lured there by saying that they were either going to drink or do drugs, or he would offer them something that they were in need of at that point in time. Now, this all happened in a quiet little neighborhood that all families and all these young people assumed to be safe. They have never had anything like this happen at all. So they didn't know what was going on at this point in time. Now, one of the young victims that ended up being found quite early from the time he went missing, he was out collecting bottles for trying to get money enough to take his girlfriend on a date. Now, they think that this one was lured back to the promise of more bottles so he could turn them in for money. And all of these other ones were always promised something else. Like I said, drugs or money or whatever. Or drinking, having a party. That's really what they thought they were going to this house for. Now, once these young men crossed this threshold of this man's house, they never came out again until they were deceased. Now, police, like I said at the time, didn't know anything about this man. And this carried on for years. So when the call came, and this is how they actually found out who he was and what was going on, there was another couple that had been kidnapped. And now this is the first female out of all of these young men that had actually been known to meet or encounter this man and these other boys. And It was when they were forced or were trying to be forced to do something. Now, give or take, this man, he had made these homemade, I guess, devices, you would call them, by using plywood and handcuffs. He would cuff their hands in the corners and their feet in the corners, and had handcuffs, and so he made these homemade devices. And he would force these people or these victims to do things that they didn't want to do. Now, when this all started, we don't know how many victims are actually out there. We only know of the victims that were found or were there and only were told the ones that could be proven. Now, like I said, he had these two younger guys that were helping him. And one of the younger guys that was there at the time of this couple's abduction, he was there and he was forcing this man to take off his clothes because he was going to force them to have intercourse with each other. And the guy had the older gentleman walked out of the room. And while he was out of the room, she looked at him, and I guess he said that she was the only one that got through to him. She had told him, "Why are you doing this? And can't you do anything to stop this? And this is crazy." And got into his head. And he was like, "You know what? You're right." And he had picked up a loaded weapon, and he had fired and unloaded this weapon into this the older gentleman, and his name was Correll, Corll. I don't know if that's exactly how you say it. Now, when he had done this, he had called the police, and he had told them, "Okay, so I just in self-defense, and I need the police here immediately." Now, when the police arrived, they ended up going into the house, of course, and finding this couple, and they started telling them what has happened to them already. So then the other guy that was there during this time that did this offense, started telling them, "I have so much I need to tell you, and you're not going to believe it because of how bad it is, but I need to get this off my chest." So he goes into telling the police that he and this other guy, along with the older guy that he just assaulted, that they were luring young boys and men into the house with certain promises, and he would take advantage of these boys and then murder them. Now, he said, I actually went and I helped them we helped bury these bodies after the fact, and we can tell you where they're at. Now, I personally only helped with 9, and the other one supposedly only helped with 4. But I highly that's highly unlikely with how many victims there were. Now, when the police started to understand that all of these missing boys that they assumed were runaways and didn't really look into it very far, came about, then they started putting the pieces together. Now, there was also one boy that went missing, and then a year later, his brother also went missing. So this is 2 boys from the same family. Now, you got to imagine how these parents had felt knowing that their kids didn't run away, but that was how it appeared. Later on, he goes and says, "Okay, so this is where we buried these bodies. And when this happened, they started digging. And they found an obscene amount of bodies. Some of them were only in half. Some of them were whole. Some of them had been buried for a long time. But the first body that they found was the missing boy that had only been missing for 5 days. The parents were extremely grief-stricken, but they stayed together through all of this. And they said that they are honestly lucky because they only had to not know for 5 days. Now, these other families, like I said, didn't know where their kids were for years. Now, so with all of this going on, and this guy like talking, they end up finding out that there was more locations of burials. They ended up finding like 4 more on a beach. They found 2 together in like the woods. They found like 6 more in another location. So this is well close to 30 bodies at this point of these missing kids. And nobody knew nothing about this. That's how under wraps these 3 kept it. Now, one showed remorse a little bit by, and that's why he did what he had done and told the police exactly where these bodies could be found. But the other one didn't act like he cared very much at all. And he unfortunately passed in prison way earlier than expected. Now, like I said, the main one, though, Corell, or however you say his name, the police are still not certain if this is all the bodies that he's collected. He had said, or he couldn't have said, but the other one had said he had moved around a lot. He had a lot of rental properties as well. So who's to say that missing men or young boys were not victims of this man, and that they could possibly be buried in on his land. Now, police did dig up one of his properties that were supposedly maybe a possible burial site, and they did not find anything. Now, yes, that is unfortunate, but it's also a good thing because then obviously not another young victim was found. Now, this is also around the time you have to think of Johon Wayne Gacy. And the young man this is how sinister I felt like he was. He had stated, and I quote, "Well, I can't believe that they're all over Johon Wayne Gacy's house and there's so much news and so much backlash and so much this and so much information when we had a higher kill count than he did." And I thought that was crazy. Now, keep in mind, too, one of the guys that had done this offense with this other man, he had stated, string a victim is not like it is in the movies. In the movies, it's that quick. And he had said that in real life, sometimes it took an hour to an hour and a half to string their victims. And to me, that was just, you have no remorse when that is at its peak. Because you just sit there and you talk about how easy it was to do this to somebody's child, or even watch, or, be a part of this. So, since the main leader, I guess, was now actually deceased, they decided to give each one like 6 life sentences or 5 life sentences. And at least one of them was like, well, I'd tell you, where the bodies were if there were more, if I knew, because, I'm not getting out and there's no point in not telling the truth at this point. So, like I said, it's crazy how they don't think that this is a big deal. And Well, one of them, I guess, showed some signs, but the other one didn't show that he even really cared. The only thing I think he was worried about was that he actually got caught. And it's still really sad because, yes, most of the victims were identified, but you still have one that's out there that has still been unidentified. And like the police said, if this guy had friends or he had family or some known something, how would they not identify him? How would nobody know that this specific boy went missing? Now, I wonder if this boy could have been not from the area, like they were saying, since he moved around and that's just where he ended up. But, I mean, that's highly unlikely, that considering that all of these other boys that were found buried were from the area within the 3 years that they had gone missing. Now, I don't know how it got to be that many victims and no one find out. But this house was so quiet and like you would not know what was going on behind closed doors. Police said that this house looked like any other ordinary house on the block. And Carell had always seemed to be like a nice person on the outside. You wouldn't know that he had this gruesome, like, tendencies or whatever you want to call them. And in behind closed doors, you wouldn't think that he would be doing this sodomy and SAs, and as much as the victims suffered, and they said that a lot of these victims were beaten prior to being murdered. And that to me is horrible. And so some of these are like, well, you know how we learned that our kids passed. It's going to haunt them and their parents for for the rest of their life, if they're even still alive. Now, I did think, and I did come to find out, that there was only one couple that was left alive, that are still alive, of the victims, one of the child that had been murdered. And they're still together, and they were still doing great, from what I understand. And they just want everybody out there to know, don't give up, and always stay strong and positive as much as possible. But I just thought this one was really interesting. So if you think so, let me know. I want to know what your thoughts are on this, because this was crazy to me. All right, y'all, until next time. Bye.